At 11:30 p.m., 3 men climbed out of a federal prison that was never supposed to let anyone leave alive. No guns, no riot, no inside help, just homemade tools, stolen raincoats, and a plan that took months to execute and seconds to fail. Below them, freezing black water, violent currents, and a 1-mile swim that had already killed trained soldiers. Behind them, armed guards, searchlights, and a system built to erase hope. By morning, their beds were still warm. Their heads were still visible. And the prison had no idea they were already gone. No bodies were ever found. No proof they drowned. No proof they survived. Just fragments, rumors, and one question that has haunted American criminal history for more than 60 years. Did they beat the most secure prison on earth? Or did the ocean finish what the system started? Frank Morris had been escaping prisons since he was a teenager. By the time he reached Alcatraz, he wasn't serving time for a single crime, but for a pattern: robbery, drugs, repeated escapes, and a refusal to stay contained. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were the same type of problem. Bank robberies across multiple states, years in and out of custody, and multiple escape attempts already on record. These were not men sent to Alcatraz by accident. They were sent there because standard prisons had failed. What the Bureau of Prisons didn't account for was that Morris and the Anglins already knew each other. They had crossed paths before, shared cells before, and more importantly, shared experience beating confinement. Inside Alcatraz, they didn't talk about freedom. They talked about routines, guard timing, cell construction, and weaknesses that didn't exist on blueprints. Within weeks, they identified the same flaw independently: the ventilation grills beneath their sinks. Decades of salt air had softened the concrete. What looked solid was brittle. What was meant to move air could be turned into an exit. This was not desperation. This was recognition. Alcatraz wasn't unbeatable. It was just old. And once Morris and the Anglins confirmed that fact, the escape stopped being an idea. It became a project. The work started quietly and never stopped. Night after night, Morris and the Anglin brothers widened the vents beneath their sinks, using whatever wouldn't raise suspicion: stolen spoons, broken saw blades, scrap metal pulled from maintenance jobs. Progress was measured in inches and weeks. During the day, the holes were concealed with handmade vent covers molded from soap, toilet paper, and stolen paint, pressed back into place so perfectly that guards never noticed the difference. The noise was masked during music hour, when an accordion echoed through the cell block, swallowing the sound of concrete crumbling behind the walls. By the time the openings were large enough, they weren't escaping yet. They were mapping. Behind the cells was an unguarded utility corridor, a dead space never meant for inmates. Pipes ran upward. Dust covered the floor. No cameras, no patrols. They climbed into it like it had been waiting. From there, they reached an unused cell above their block and turned it into a workshop. Raincoats were smuggled piece by piece. Glue was stolen. Magazines were studied for buoyancy and current patterns. Over months, the men stitched, tested, and rebuilt, turning trash into a raft capable of carrying weight across open water. This wasn't impulsive. It was methodical, patient, and invisible. Alcatraz didn't fail in one night. It failed slowly, every time the guards walked past a cell and saw nothing wrong. By early June, the escape no longer depended on chance. It depended on timing. The raft was finished, stitched from more than 50 stolen raincoats, sealed tight enough to hold air and weight. Wooden paddles were cut from scrap and shaped by hand. The ceiling vent in the utility corridor had been weakened for weeks, loosened just enough to be removed without noise. Every movement was rehearsed. Every guard's route memorized. Lights, head counts, and silence followed patterns, and patterns could be exploited. The final variable was Alan West. He had helped dig, helped hide, helped move supplies, but his vent wasn't ready. The concrete around it hadn't been widened enough. On the night of June 11th, 1962, Morris and the Anglin brothers placed the fake heads in their beds, pulled the blankets up, and climbed into the walls for the last time. West tried to follow and failed. The hardened filler around his vent wouldn't break. While he chipped and scraped, the others moved on. There was no discussion, no delay. If they waited, the entire plan collapsed. Morris and the Anglins climbed into the corridor, reached the workshop, grabbed the raft, and pried open the ceiling vent. From that moment on, there was no prison left behind them, only distance. West was still alive when the cell block went quiet again. The escape had already happened without him. They emerged onto the roof just before midnight, carrying everything they would ever get. The drop was nearly 50 feet, straight down a kitchen vent pipe slick with moisture and rust. One slip meant broken bones or death in the yard. They slid down anyway. Searchlights swept the ground in slow, predictable arcs, missing the blind spot along the northeast shoreline. The guards in the towers never looked down long enough. Morris and the Anglins crossed the yard, climbed a 12-foot fence topped with barbed wire, and reached the water without triggering an alarm. The raft was inflated using the accordion they had hidden for months, each breath stolen from time they didn't have. At approximately 11:30 p.m., they pushed off from the island. The bay was black, violent, and cold enough to paralyze limbs in minutes. Currents pulled west toward the open ocean, exactly where bodies were expected to end up. That assumption would later shape the official story. The raft disappeared into the darkness. No one saw them swim. No one heard them scream. By the time the first head count failed at dawn, the island had already lost them. All that remained were 3 empty cells, 3 fake heads, and water that refused to give answers. The discovery came too late to matter. During the morning count, guards noticed the silence first, then the stillness. When one of the heads was touched, it rolled off the pillow and hit the floor. Within minutes, Alcatraz was sealed. Boats swept the bay. Helicopters circled overhead. Search teams dragged the water where currents were strongest, exactly where officials expected 3 bodies to surface. Pieces of the raft were recovered. A paddle fragment, shreds of rubber. The narrative wrote itself. The men drowned. Case closed. But the evidence never cooperated. No bodies were found. No clothing washed ashore. No remains surfaced in the following weeks, months, or years. The currents that were supposed to erase them didn't deliver proof. Neither did the water temperature. Investigators quietly acknowledged a problem. The escape route had worked. The raft had functioned. And the timing matched tidal patterns that could carry someone toward land, not out to sea. Reports were revised. Language changed. Presumed drowned replaced certainty. Sightings began to circulate. South America, the Midwest, Brazil, a Christmas card, a family photo. None confirmed, none dismissed. Officially, the case remains open. Unofficially, it became something worse than a failure. Alcatraz wasn't beaten by force or luck. It was beaten by patience, observation, and a system that assumed its own myth was stronger than the men testing it. The federal response hardened fast, not because of evidence, but because of embarrassment. Alcatraz had been sold to the public as final. No parole, no hope, no exits. 3 missing inmates shattered that illusion overnight. Investigators leaned into the drowning theory because it preserved the myth. If the men died, the prison still won. But internally, reports told a different story. The escape route was reconstructed and quietly confirmed as viable. The raft design was tested and proven capable of staying afloat. Tidal experts noted that the currents at that hour did not pull straight into the open ocean. They curved toward Marin headlands. That detail never made the headlines. Instead, the Bureau focused on debris, selectively released findings, and closed ranks. Alan West was questioned aggressively and then sidelined. His failure made him irrelevant. The official conclusion settled into ambiguity by design. Insufficient evidence to determine survival. Not dead, not alive, just erased. Years later, family members reported signs that didn't fit the drowning narrative. money sent overseas, a mother receiving flowers anonymously, a photograph allegedly taken in Brazil showing two men who looked too familiar to ignore. None of it was enough to reopen the case publicly. Alcatraz had already been decommissioned. The government had moved on. What remained was a problem without a body and a system that never admitted uncertainty. In the end, the escape didn't just remove 3 prisoners from a prison. It exposed something more dangerous. When a system relies on reputation instead of proof, it doesn't need to be broken. It just needs to be tested. What happened after that night has never been settled, and that uncertainty is the most unsettling part of the case. If the men drowned, Alcatraz remains undefeated. If they survived, the prison failed in the only way that mattered. Investigators revisited the timeline repeatedly and kept running into the same problem. The facts refused to align with a clean ending. The water temperature was survivable for a limited window. The raft fragments suggested damage, not collapse. The currents at that hour favored landfall, not disappearance, and yet no physical remains ever surfaced. Years later, the case was quietly reclassified, shifting from certainty to probability. Files began using language designed to close doors without locking them. Meanwhile, rumors filled the gap left by evidence. Family members claimed contact. Old associates reported sightings. A photograph allegedly taken in South America showed 2 aging men standing side by side, their faces blurred by time, but their resemblance undeniable. None of it could be verified, but none of it could be disproven either. The absence of bodies became the story. Alcatraz was built to produce endings, sentences served, hopes extinguished, men contained. Instead, it produced a question that still hasn't stopped echoing. Did the prison do its job, or did 3 inmates walk away from the most secure federal facility in American history and vanish into the system's blind spot? Not every escape relies on tunnels, rafts, or darkness. Some rely on paperwork. Frank Abagnale didn't break out of prison by force. He walked out by convincing the system he belonged on the other side of the bars. After years of check fraud and impersonation, he was finally caught overseas and deported back to the United States under guard. The first escape happened before his sentence even began. While the plane sat on the tarmac, Abagnale slipped through the galley and vanished into the airport, exploiting an era when security depended more on assumption than verification. Weeks later, he was caught again and placed in a federal detention center in Atlanta. That's where the real escape happened. The paperwork for his intake never arrived. Guards filled the gap with speculation. Abagnale fed it. He claimed to be a prison inspector operating undercover, a lie reinforced by confidence, calm behavior, and fake credentials produced with outside help. He wasn't placed in a jumpsuit. He wasn't treated like an inmate. He was treated like a visitor. Using forged FBI business cards and a payphone posing as headquarters, he orchestrated his own release. Guards escorted him out the front door and handed him to his girlfriend's car. No alarm sounded because nothing illegal appeared to be happening. The system didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it trusted its own procedures more than evidence. Yoshi Shiratori's escapes didn't look clever. They looked desperate, slow, and almost inhuman. Arrested in pre-war Japan, he was beaten into confessions, locked into cells designed to erase resistance, and treated as a body to be contained rather than a person to be judged. His first escape came with nothing more than a metal band torn from a wash bucket, bent into a crude lockpick. He waited, learned guard rhythms, and walked straight through doors that were never meant to open from the inside. He was caught days later and punished harder. The second prison answered escape with isolation, smooth walls, high ceilings, constant restraints. Shiratori answered with patience. He slipped his cuffs, climbed barehanded up copper walls, and attacked the weakest part of the room, a wooden skylight frame rotted by weather. He broke it open during a storm, using thunder to hide the sound. At Abashiri Prison, one of the coldest and most brutal in Japan, the system tried to end the problem permanently. His limbs were bound, his cell was iron, food was scarce. What they overlooked was time. Shiratori saved the salty miso soup he was fed each day and poured it onto bolts, hinges, and shackles. Over months, the metal corroded. One night, he removed his restraints, unbolted the observation window, dislocated his shoulders, and forced his body through an opening smaller than his chest. After surviving alone in the wilderness for years, he was caught again after a fatal fight over stolen food. This time, something changed. Kindness replaced cruelty. His death sentence was overturned. He served his time and was released. Shiratori didn't escape because he was smarter than the system. He escaped because the system taught him how fragile it really was. These escapes endure because they force an uncomfortable question Americans have never fully answered. When a system is built on control instead of accountability, is breaking out a crime or a reaction? Alcatraz, Abagnale, Shiratori, different countries, different eras, same flaw. Each system trusted its own reputation more than reality. It assumed fear was enough. It assumed paperwork meant truth. It assumed walls could replace judgment. And every time, that assumption was tested by people willing to wait, watch, and exploit what others ignored. These stories aren't about glorifying criminals. They're warnings. Any institution that stops questioning itself becomes vulnerable, not to chaos, but to the quiet person studying it from the inside. That's why these cases still haunt investigators decades later. They remind us that power without oversight doesn't just fail, it invites failure. If you want more deep dives into real cases where systems collapse under pressure, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe for more dark history that refuses to fade.